Hey, we're actually going to continue this sermon series called What Now? Living in kind of the time of the COVID-19. And so just a quick update. Next week, Kathy will actually conclude this sermon series. And we'll also have a special announcement about kind of what's happening at our church. So you don't want to miss next week. We'd love for you to be there. Meanwhile, we're talking about this passage from Joshua chapter 1, verses 1 to 9. And, I think it's interesting because it comes at a very pivotal moment in the history of Israel. Now, if you know anything about the people of Israel, and if you're not a Christian here, welcome. So glad you're here. Even as I mentioned this story, you've probably heard the name Moses before. Now, Moses is like this iconic, unbelievable figure in the history of Israel. In fact, he's the one that's known to have written kind of the first 5 books of the Hebrew scriptures. And the first 5 books, of course, contains the histories of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. He's the one that led the people of Israel out of captivity and slavery and into, or almost into, the promised land. In fact, he would leave captivity, kind of be freed, part the Red Sea, do all sorts of miracles, witness the hand of God. And he would end up leading the people in this time in the wilderness before they would enter into the promised land. Now, he himself never entered into the promised land, but there comes this moment where he dies. And so if you can imagine this larger than life figure who was responsible for spearheading and leading the people of Israel in their darkest hour, miracle after miracle, he was someone who would basically see rocks kind of produce water to drink from, manna that would come from heaven that we talked about last week, parting the Red Sea, the Passover, all of these experiences. If you can imagine Moses as this towering figure, and then he dies. Can you imagine just the weightiness of that moment? These millions of people now who are now without their leader. The despair. Meanwhile, they're in the wilderness. They haven't even reached the promised land yet. So they're still in this time of suffering and difficulty. Now, the book of Joshua is a book that opens up with this transition from the death of Moses to Joshua now leading the people. Joshua is Moses' apprentice, protege, someone who had been called by God to lead in his stead. But can you imagine the overwhelming feelings that Joshua must have felt? Like you're replacing Moses, this iconic figure. Over the past few weekends, I've been looking forward to watching The Last Dance, the story of Michael Jordan and his last kind of hurrah, but it's really a retrospective on his entire career. And, can you imagine someone like that who kind of just this towering celebrity, powerful figure and kind of the death of that person or the loss of that person. And if you can imagine for Moses, just how much bigger that was to the people of Israel. And here Joshua is in this moment. Now, I think it's interesting how Joshua 1 begins, because check this out. Look at how this historical account is said. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' aide, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now, I underline that, and you're probably wondering, why are you underlining this? I underline it because here God is speaking in this moment to Joshua, in this overwhelming position that Joshua must be in. And his first words to Joshua are not like, Joshua, you got this. You're my boy. You got this. No, it's, hey, Joshua, Moses, my servant, is dead. That's it. That's reality. That's what we're talking about. Moses, my servant, is dead. Now, I think it's fascinating that the way that God kind of opens up and he starts with this, he's basically giving an account of what does reality look like. And in some ways, I think this passage actually points to the reality that Christianity and who we believe God to be is not some fanciful God that is devoid from the reality that we experience today, but that God and our faith is one that's actually steeped in the truth of reality, of what is really happening. It's not glossed over. It's not minimized. It's actually right there front and center. Moses, my servant, is dead. This is very consistent with what Jesus would teach about what Christianity was about. Like in John chapter 14, this is what he says. I am the way, the truth, and the life. That again, Christianity is not some sort of escapist kind of myth. But it's actually something that invites us into the truth And so whether you're a Christian or you're not, you might have asked this question before. Is Christianity, is it a myth or a fantasy, or is it reality? Now, here's what kind of the writer of Joshua is saying. Is God says this to Joshua. It's steeped in such reality. It's like, listen, Moses, my servant, is dead. There is no running from this fact. There is no way that I'm going to gloss this over. And so Christianity is not some sort of myth or fantasy. It's actually steeped in reality. And what this passage tells us, and even in this moment that we find ourselves in COVID-19, there are all sorts of temptations to try to gloss things over and maybe hyper spiritualize things in such a manner that is devoid of reality. And believe me, I have that temptation myself. This past week, I was asked to be on this call, this national call with pastors and leaders. And one of the questions they were asking me is like, how can you be emotionally healthy leading in the midst of this crisis? You know, and I'll tell you, every single thing in me wanted to say like, oh, you know, you just gotta focus on Jesus in this moment. The reality of resurrection power, that God is with us. Now, all of that is very real and true. But here was my response, because I knew that that was my temptation to answer in such a way, because people were looking at me as this expert in New York, in the middle of New York. How do you live in this emotionally healthy manner in the midst of this? And here's what I said. I said, I have no clue. I've been in more arguments with my wife over the past week than it feels like I was in over the last 3 months. You know, I've had such a difficult time with trying to manage working from home, homeschooling, and fielding calls from people who are suffering and sick and dying. And honestly, this is the most devastating ordeal I have ever been through in my entire life. And then it was kind of like, maybe we should just pray during this call here as we talk about it. But I mean, it was just this funny moment as I look back, because everything in me wanted to give this hyper puffed spiritual answer. But what I needed to start with was reality. The reality is, this situation that you and I find ourselves in, the fact that we're quarantined, that we're away from people that we love, that many of the people that you and I know are sick, and that our city and the economic devastation. Hey, can we just be real? This is maybe the worst experience any of us have ever been through. And I think it's okay to admit that, to simply clearly state that, and to grieve it. And if you look at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, there's actually this period in which the people of Israel grieve the death of Moses. And I think that for God to, in this moment, and his pep talk to Joshua, to start with, hey, Moses is dead. It's just, he's giving him a permission to live in this reality. And again, I think this is a comfort to the Christian faith. In fact, C.S. Lewis, he puts it this way. He says, I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it, I see everything else. And so in many ways, Christianity is this way of looking at the world that shows us what reality is. And the reality is, we are in an incredibly dark time. Now, I don't even need to say that for each of you to probably be like, yep, I totally get it. We are in a crushing time. But of course, and thankfully, that's not only what our faith is about. Now check out what God would say to Joshua in the midst of what he's going through. Look at what he says. He says, yes, Moses, my servant, is dead. But then he says this, now then. While you're muted, can you say that? Now then. Thank you. Now then, you and all these people get ready to cross the Jordan River into the land I'm about to give to them. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. Be strong and courageous. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. For the Lord, your God, will be with you wherever you go. You see, Christianity is not only this faith that ushers us into reality, but it also invites us into strength and courage. Christianity is strong and courageous in the midst of reality. There's someone from our church who I just found out today was had COVID and was hospitalized and recovered. And just as I was sending this person a note, the person wrote back to me, "Oh yeah, I'm about to go in to donate some of the antibody and plasma for all of these efforts that hospitals have in fighting this virus." And I was just like, man, strong and courageous in the midst of reality. Someone who's looking for redemptive way in the midst of this. I think that's beautiful. And this is what Christianity calls us to strength and courage in the midst of reality. Now, one might think, right? Because here's the thing, I can say, so therefore, in the midst of this really tragic and difficult circumstance, be stronger, be more courageous. You can do it. You've got this. Now, here's the thing. Every temptation in me wants to say that and to do that, to talk about the triumph of the human spirit. And you would think, actually, that God, the encouragement to be strong and courageous, one might think that it's be strong and courageous because Joshua, you've been groomed for this moment. You are someone that has all the gifts and the talents and the wherewithal and the wealth and all this at your disposal. You've got everything you need. But that's not what God says to Joshua to hang his hat on. In other words, what is the thing that God is inviting Joshua to be strong and courageous about? What is it? What is it? Joshua's good looks? Is it his great health? Is it his great wealth? Is it the fact that he has a job? What is it? Now notice what it is. Look at what the book of Joshua tells us. He says, as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. Be strong and courageous. Joshua, you might think that Moses' superpower was his intellect, his ingenuity, his wealth, his God-given talent. But don't you know, his superpower was my presence. That the God of the universe is with you, just as I was with Moses. I'm with you in your apartment, in your quarantine, separated from people that you love. There is this promise. I am with you. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. For the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. What's the source of our strength and courage? Is it our hope is in governments and chariots and whatever else? Or is it in the presence of our God who tells us be strong and courageous? Now, this does not mean that we do not pray for vaccines and governments and health officials. What it means is that for each of us, the very heartbeat of our strength and courage does not come from this world. It comes from him, the God who Jesus is called Emmanuel, God with us, with you, with me. And I would love for us to read together this quote from Charles Spurgeon. And I'm going to invite you to read it with me wherever you are. And we can stay muted, but here's what I would love for you to read with me. Let's begin. Emmanuel, God with us in our nature, in our sorrow, in our life work, in our punishment, in our grave, and now with us, or rather we with him, in resurrection, ascension, triumph, and second advent splendor. God with us, God with you, God with me, right now, as strange as this might seem, God with us.